One morning, a mother duck who had been sitting on her eggs for a long time felt them stir beneath her, and she knew it was time. One after the other, the eggs cracked and out hatched the sweet little ducks, her babies. There were 7 or 8 of them. And just as the last one was hatching, she noticed this other egg in her nest that looked slightly weird and different. It was a different colour and a different size. And suddenly it began to hatch. And out of the egg came this strange baby that the mother didn't recognise as being her own. This little duckling, didn't look like his brothers or sisters. Different textured feathers, different colours. The noise the little duckling made was different too. Meanwhile, as all the other little ducklings were getting used to being in the world and huddling up near the mother duck, this odd one out duck was slightly standing apart, didn't really know what to do and felt awkward. And the mother was looking at it, and the other little ducklings were looking at it and wondering who this strange member of the family was. And so the story goes, you'll recognise, of the ugly duckling. And so begins a life of woe and stress for this poor little duck, who's born into a family as the unwanted one, the different one, the uninvited one, the unwelcome one, the one who stands out, the odd one out, the ugly duckling. And the story goes that this little duckling is completely abandoned by its mother. Its mother disowns it and doesn't recognise it and just sees it as an outcast and the one that just doesn't fit in. And all the little sisters and brothers as well start jeering at the odd one out and teasing this duckling, calling him the ugly duckling. And so begins the first rejection for this little duckling, who's abandoned by his mother and his family, and off he goes onto a path to try and find somewhere to belong. And you remember the story, he goes around to all sorts of different contexts, a farm, and then all the farm animals start mocking him. And then he goes to another little nest to see if he can mix with some other birds, and they push him out because he's different. And it goes on all these different contexts. And then in the end, you'll remember the so-called happily ever after ending, where after a long winter where he'd actually given up to try and fit in or find anyone to love him, he decides to spend a whole winter on his own in a cave. And then he finds that so lonely and awful that he just goes out of the cave. It's springtime and he sees these beautiful white swans landing on the pond. And he just says to himself, probably they're going to jeer at me, probably they're going to mock me, but I don't care, I've got nothing to lose. And he flies down onto the pond in hope that they might let him join and that he might be able to belong to them. And as he's swooping down, he sees a mirror image of himself in the pond, a reflection, and he gets a shock. He didn't think that he was an ugly duckling anymore, and he looked at his reflection and he looked exactly like these swans, and he found his place, and the mother swan embraces him and he takes his place in the queue behind all the little swans following the mummy swan, and off they go. And this is meant to be the happily ever after. And as they swoosh off together in the lake, they come across the duck family, and the little ugly duckling, who's now obviously a swan, looks at them and says, haha, look, I belong, I found my true family, and look, I'm a swan, I'm the grandiose, much more grandiose creature than you ducks. And so the tale ends. So I find this tale quite devastating, actually, and not for the reasons one might think. I mean, yes, the rejection and the abandonment is a huge wound for this ugly duckling, the unwelcome one, the uninvited, the odd one out. Like I said before, it's a trope that we're familiar with in fairy tale about the outcast and myth, and actually the whole Western and probably lots of other traditions. The uninvited one, the unwanted one, the abandoned one, the one that's made to feel ugly, rejected because of their difference. So it's a really important trope to think about how families or groups or communities bond together through a kind of desire to reject somebody else. So the hatred of this little ugly duckling, or the mockery of this little ugly duckling, functions to cement or bond the group together to feel sort of smug and comfortable and secure in their sameness. So the way in which the story goes is that the little ugly duckling hangs on to this idea of belonging really rigidly, and the reaction to his abandonment and his rejection and the cruelness of the people around him because he's different leads him just to want to belong more, and it fuels his ardent desire to find somewhere where he can fit in and where he's embraced and he's accepted. And then what I feel about this is that when you see, as a child, I remember like this sort of ambivalence of like, especially when the two families passed each other, and it's just so sort of divisive, so that one imagines the little ugly so-called duckling who was different and ostracized and made a scapegoat and made to feel unwanted and different. In the end, all he wants is to just be the same and belong and fit in this kind of uniform queue. And I just remember looking at the queue of the little baby ducks and the little white swans, and them all being like exactly the same as each other, and that being the kind of desire. And I find that actually horrifying, that the response to this ugly duckling's rejection is just internalizing the structure of belonging and just wanting to belong more, so that you can even imagine once he takes his place in the community of swans that he does belong to, you can imagine him behaving exactly the same way as the little ugly, the little ducklings acted to him. So that because of his like relief at belonging, finally, you can imagine that if, you know, that any kind of difference would be scorned by him too, rather than maybe there could be a possible different response to that. So I wanted to think about the ugly duckling in relation to opening up a kind of idea of space of choice, about how the options open to this in terms of responding to being ostracized and excluded and uninvited and unwelcome and unwanted because of one's difference. So rather than the ugly duckling just chasing after belonging in this really sort of obsessed way of just, I need to belong, I need to be the same, I need to be in the queue of the little white ducks and be in the uniform and be the same and let me belong, and just rushing through all of these awful situations of bullying in order to find where he can fit in. Now, what other responses have we got to think about in relation to this story? So I'm thinking of the great story of it's from Greek myth, but I think it's associated completely to the ugly duckling story. And it's the story of the goddess Eris, who is the goddess of strife and discord. And she is the only goddess who's not invited to a big wedding that's happening on Mount Olympus, where all the gods and goddesses are invited. It's like a really big deal wedding. And the only goddess that's not invited is Eris. Now, you might want to sort of think that, well, why is she not invited? Because she's the goddess of strife and discord, so it's a wedding. So, you know, it's inevitable they might not have thought that she was the best kind of guest to invite to their festivities. However, when Eris finds out that she's the uninvited one, that she's the only excluded one, she doesn't just go like fawning around trying to find another party and trying to belong like the ugly duckling does. What she does is she comes to the wedding anyway. She says, I don't care if I'm not invited. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come to the wedding and I'm going to show you what your exclusivity and bonding over exclusion really, really looks like. And she comes to the wedding uninvited. And in her hand, she has a golden apple. And on the golden apple, she's written, to the fairest, the most beautiful of us all, for the most beautiful, something like that. And she throws the golden apple into the wedding party, where all the gods and goddesses are flamboyantly like partying and having their festivities and drinking ambrosia and feeling very important and joyous in their this special wedding. And suddenly Eris stands at the door, the uninvited one, without an invitation and without being welcomed. She throws this golden apple into the corner of the room where the most important goddesses are standing around, chatting and singing and doing whatever they were doing. In the corner of the wedding, it was Hera, Zeus's wife, very important goddess, Athena, goddess of wisdom, and Aphrodite, goddess of love. And into the corner of these three goddesses, Eris, the goddess of strife, throws her grenade, her golden apple, and the goddesses, everyone at the party sees this beautiful golden apple that says, to the fairest, to the most beautiful of us all. And they scramble around, and suddenly they lose all their integrity, and they're scrambling around, fighting and trying to get this golden apple. It's mine, it's mine, it's mine, it's mine. The whole wedding turns into a complete fray of chaos because of this golden apple that they're all fighting over, because they want to be the best, they want to be the most beautiful. So the conflict has to get resolved by Paris, who's the Prince of Troy, and he gets the golden apple, and it's up to him. There's a contest set up of who's going to get this beautiful prize of saying who's the fairest of us all. And Athena says, if you give me the golden apple, if you say that I'm the most beautiful, most best of all, I'll give you the deepest wisdom for the rest of your time. And then Hera said, if you give me the golden apple, I'll give you success in politics for the rest of your life. And Aphrodite says to Paris, if you give me the apple, I'll give you the most beautiful woman in the whole world. So you'll recognize this as the beginning of the Trojan War. And Paris says he wants Aphrodite. So he wants Aphrodite's prize. He wants the most beautiful woman in the whole world. And then if she gets that, then the golden apple will go to Aphrodite, the goddess of love. And so this is the bargain that happens. And meanwhile, the whole wedding is completely wrecked. You know, they're all fighting. There's this contest. And then, of course, Aphrodite has to give the prize to Paris in response to receiving the golden apple, and the most beautiful woman in the world is Helen of Troy, becomes Helen of Troy, who Paris then has to steal away from Greece and take her to Troy, and she becomes the famous Helen of Troy. There's a war for 10 years raging between the Greek army and the Trojan army, all over this, taking Helen away because Paris won her over this contest around the golden apple. Now, I don't know if you were aware of that backstory of the Trojan War, but it all started from somebody not being invited to the wedding. So the wound of exclusion, the ugly duckling's rejection from his mother and his family and from everywhere he goes, the wound of being the different one, the only one that didn't get an invitation, the unwelcome one, the one that's considered a troublemaker like Eris, goddess of strife, the one that dares to have her own mind, that dares to have her own ideas about things, that dares to not toe the party line. This is Eris, and in her defiance of this exclusiveness and the being not invited to this kind of club, this the grenade that she throws into the wedding, what that does is it gives her this agency, not just being a gratuitous troublemaker, but actually what she amazingly does through this act is to reveal, like I said before, really what motivates these people who think that they're bonded together in some kind of dignified way. But as soon as there's this promise of someone's being the best, you know, it's a bit like mirror, mirror on the wall, Snow White's mother, who's the fairest of us all, and her being obsessed with being the most beautiful woman in the land. This sort of narcissistic egotism of needing to be the best. I mean, I talk about that in a different video, what might underlie that. But what Eris does is uses this opportunity of being the excluded one, being the outsider, to do a kind of act of sort of like a sort of revolutionary act of defiance, and that kind of literally smashes apart the structures of this exclusive wedding party and shows the motivation of all of the characters that have excluded her, which is just a desire for power and to be the best, which is so amplified because it actually starts a whole 10-year war. So I think it's really interesting that Eris her woundedness of being excluded leads to this defiant act, which she doesn't gain from, like, personally. It doesn't personally give her anything in particular, and nor does it particularly give her revenge. It's a really intelligent act, because what it does, it just throws something in the mix in order to show their responses, which they take responsibility for. It was their choice to scramble around for the apple and fight over it, and it was their choice to then make this transactional bargain with Paris in the middle of the wedding, and then it was the choice of the society to go to war over this situation, which all started from just not inviting one guest to the wedding. So you see, I'm trying to say that the ugly duckling and Eris share something, which is being rejected, excluded, the uninvited, the unwelcome one. But Eris, she doesn't want to belong. That's not her issue. That's not her response, is it? She decides to take responsibility for being on the outside and trying to show something about the inside by being on the outside, and showing what underlies and motivates the structure of the bond that bonds people together. And so her act of defiance is subversive and transgressive, in that it reveals the structures that underlie this whole notion of belonging. Whereas all the ugly duckling does is just chases after belonging without critiquing it, without questioning it, without thinking, oh, do I just want to be one of those like same little swans in a line, and who's probably going to go and bully the other next one who looks a bit different? Do I want to just reproduce the whole system of belonging and not belonging, and keep that binary intact and just reproduce it over and over again, and feel smug in my very temporary belongingness? Well, no, Eris doesn't want to do that. What Eris wants to do is to throw a spanner in the works in order to show the underlying value systems of what holds these sorts of so-called exclusive bonds together. And then there's a third example that I think is really useful and interesting to thinking about the response to being the excluded one, the possible opening up a space of choice to think, well, how one might respond to that. Either be like the ugly duckling, which is just yearning after belonging in an obsessive way, just wanting to belong and reproducing the same, as I've just said. Or Eris being quite a defiant kind of troublemaker, but not a gratuitous troublemaker, a troublemaker that wants to show the underlying structures of the sort of dominant system. And then a third one is the myth of another ancient Greek myth of Chiron. And Chiron is he's a centaur. It's a really beautiful myth, this one. He's born through Zeus, who changed into a horse, as Zeus is a shapeshifter, basically. And he was on his usual mission of trying to sort of run after women, which is what Zeus does all the time. And he wanted to have intercourse with this water nymph. And anyway, in order to do that, somehow he becomes horse. And so the horse and the water nymph, the result of their union is Chiron, who is a centaur, who is a half horse and half human. And when Chiron's mother gives birth to Chiron, she's absolutely shocked and horrified by her offspring. And she looks at him and says, because he's part horse, he's hybrid, he's a hybrid creature, and she's just ashamed and horrified and doesn't feel like she recognizes him, and thinks that he's a source of shame for her. And so she abandons her baby, very much like the mother of the ugly duckling. And Chiron is meant to be this sort of to his mother, ugly and unrecognizable, exactly in the same way that the ugly duckling was. So Chiron's abandoned by his mother, and he's characterized by having a wound. And in this myth, the wound is after he'd been abandoned by his mother, he gets shot with a poison arrow in his foot, which causes a wound in his foot which will never ever heal. It's like whatever anyone does to it, it won't heal. So he's in constant perpetual pain. The way I understand this is that it's a sort of a physical wound, but what it's saying is the wound of being rejected, of being looked at by your mother as something hateful and a source of shame and abandoned, causes a wound which will never go away, a deep, profound wound. The unwanted baby, the baby that's looked at as a source of shame, the baby that's not loved, the hybrid, the one that looks a bit different, doesn't belong, doesn't fit in. And so Chiron's wound is this everlasting wound where the pain can never be healed. healed is sort of evoking that deep wound of rejection, of sort of primitive rejection on an ontological level of an abandoned baby or an unwanted, unloved baby. And so what happens with Chiron, unlike the ugly duckling, I guess, is that he gets adopted by Apollo and Athena, and he gets taught, he learns all about the healing arts and magic and becomes very, very wise. What happens is that in his pain, in his constant woundedness and pain, he learns to become a healer, and he's called the wounded healer. So Chiron, what I'm trying to say is the third option, and I'm sure there's many more, of a response to being the rejected, abandoned, unwanted, unwelcome one, is to become so empathetic with pain because of experiencing pain oneself, so empathetic with the other that one knows pain so well that one becomes a healer, and he's called the wounded healer. So using your wounds to heal rather than using your wounds to just chase after wanting to belong, to try to get rid of the pain and belong, and just like reproduce the structures of exclusion and inclusion like the ugly duckling does. Oh, Eris, the transgressive grenade throwing, putting a spanner in the works. There's that, and or there's this more sort of, you could call it sacrificial a bit, but maybe not, but the wounded healer, the Chiron approach to being abandoned and unwanted, is to use his everlasting deep woundedness and pain to become a healer. So I just think it's really interesting to see these three models of responses to being the excluded, scapegoated, unwelcomed, pushed out one, the one that's hated for his or her difference. For me, The Ugly Duckling was actually a bit of a horror story because of the homogeneous, the sameness at the end, the uniformity, and the sort of feeling of entrappedness of being stuck in this situation of the group that's all the same. Just made me feel really claustrophobic. Whereas Eris has this kind of political act that wants to smash apart this whole notion of belonging. And then Chiron has this absolute compassionate, deep, healing relationship to other people and pain because of his own pain of being in the ugly duckling situation. So I'm not saying any are, better than others, although I would probably say the ugly duckling really is a sort of it just reproduces the same system. So I think Eris and Chiron give this wonderful options, which don't have to be either or. Obviously, we can take a lot from each of them and think about our responses and the responses out there to being the unwelcome, abandoned one, abandoned on the edge of a mountain and hated because of one's difference. So let's think of Eris and Chiron to help the ugly duckling out of just this chasing after a very entrapping notion of belonging.